Hey everybody, welcome to IntroPsych. I'm doing a YouTube video lecture today on perception, which I'm going to ask you all to watch and take really thorough notes on. We've gotten a little bit behind with some cancellations and snow and so on, so this is an attempt to catch up. As you can see, that is my kitchen behind me, and can I make you a cup of coffee or would you like a cold beer? Not really. And you'll probably see my cat coming in and out of focus. I have three cats, and Layla is here with me now. There she is. That's Layla. Say hello, Layla. So, okay, it is March 4th, 2023, and I'm going to be talking about the review sheet that's in Files on Canvas called Sensation Perception. So if you have that review sheet in front of you, you can just kind of follow along. Please, again, I strongly encourage you to take notes. The first exam is going out this coming week, and you will need this information from this lecture to do a good job with that. So the topic is perception, and let me start with just kind of a generally broad definition. Perception is fundamentally about how a given individual, one human being, interprets what's coming in to their brain through their senses. And if you think about it, every single moment that you're awake, not sure why the color is changing here, every single moment that you're awake, and even when you're asleep, your brain is receiving all kinds of data through the main senses: vision, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. All of those senses you've probably studied over and over in a science class pretty much since fourth grade or so. But let me give you another way to think about what perception is, more of a philosophical way. Perception is really about what we call in psychology the construction of reality. We all kind of experience the fact that there's a reality outside of us, outside of our skin, outside of our senses. But one of the things that's very clear is you could take two people standing side by side, hearing and seeing exactly the same thing going on out there in the world, and could they come up with two very different interpretations of what they're experiencing? And the answer is a big yes. And this leads us to the idea that sometimes what really counts is not what's really happening, but how we construct reality. So one of the ideas that's embedded in perception is individuals construct external reality in different ways. The mood you're in at any given moment, happy, sad, angry, scared, worried, whatever that mood is, the mood that you're in, that inner mood, can cause you to see the reality out there around you differently. If you're 60 years old, you're going to construct reality in a different way than if you're 20 years old. Are there times that women and men in the same situation, sensing the same data coming in through their senses, will interpret what's going on in some fundamentally different ways? Will people of color interpret the world differently in the United States than white people? And on it goes. Okay, so given that that's kind of the big picture, let me start by defining two different terms that people often get mixed up. The first term is called sensation, and the second term is called perception. So let's start with sensation. Basically, sensation is about the way in which the brain, your brain, constantly receives data coming in through the different sense mechanisms of your body. Sensation is physical. It's not psychological. It's about eyes, retinas, optic nerves. It's about ears, cochlea, auditory nerves. It's about the different types of sensory data on your tongue, My cat just knocked off what are you doing over there, Layla? Yeah, I'm not paying her enough attention is what's going on right now. I know you're there, honey. You just keep knocking things off the desk. Right. So let's do a quick review. And you've been down this road before. Let's name the major senses of the human body. Obviously, vision or sight is one. Hearing, also called the auditory sense, AUDITORI, is another one. We have the sense of taste. Different types of cells on our tongues send different sorts of taste information into our brain. We have the sense of smell, also called the olfactory sense, OLFACTORY, the olfactory sense. And then we have what most of you learned in grade school is that the fifth sense is called the sense of touch. We're going to expand on that a little bit since it's a college course. Touch is only one of 4 separate skin senses. In addition to touch, there are 3 other types of cells embedded throughout your skin. And the skin, by the way, is the largest organ of the human body. We often don't think of it as an organ, but it is. Touch, pain, heat, and cold. If you take a square inch of skin, let's say on the back of your wrist, the back of your hand, in that square inch of skin are enormous numbers of touch cells, pain cells, heat detecting cells, and cold detecting cells. And this is true throughout your entire body. There's 4 different types of data that your skin is constantly feeding into your brain. So your brain knows what's going on in around your skin. Heat, cold, touch, and pain. And most of you learned the touch one, but many students are surprised to hear that there's actually 3 other skin senses sending data in. There's another sense that I want to mention very briefly. It's called the vestibular sense, VESTIBULAR. The vestibular sense is located in your inner ears. There are little fluid-filled tubes with crystals, I kid you not, floating around in these tubes. When you move your head up and down, back and forth, those crystals are moving through those little canals in each of your ears and sending information into your brain about the position of your head in space. Without the vestibular sense, you would have trouble walking. You could never play a sport. You could never be aware of what your head is doing relative to gravity and to the rest of your body. Any of you who have ever experienced vertigo, often when something goes wrong in your inner ear, it could be an inner ear infection, for example, one of the symptoms you will get is terrible vertigo, which will make you feel not just dizzy, but nauseated. And what's happening is false information is being sent from your vestibular sense into your brain. Once that problem's resolved, the vertigo and dizziness goes away. But while you have that, it is an absolutely miserable experience. But we're here today not to talk so much about sensation. Sensation is pretty much the same for every human being. We all share it in common. We've all got eyes and retinas and optic nerves and so on. It's perception that makes us different and makes us unique. So you and I can sense exactly the same data with our eyes, but we will interpret it or perceive it in somewhat different ways depending on who we are as unique individuals. Now, this fact makes life very interesting. Isn't it interesting that you and I could go to the same movie, see the same images with our eyes up on the screen, hear the same dialogue with our ears? But when we talk about that movie afterwards, could we have 2 very different perceptions or interpretations of what that movie is about? Perception and differences in perception make life interesting. Here's the flip side. Do people sometimes go to war over differences in perception, differences in interpretation? Do people sometimes have tremendous conflict with each other because we don't interpret or perceive the world in exactly the same way? He said, she said, right? I'm right, you're wrong. So perception, it's a fact of life. It makes life very interesting. We need to be around people who don't perceive the world just the way we do. That's very important. But it can also sometimes lead to conflict. If we take that one step further out, can perception sometimes lead to things like racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, right? When we have learned in our brains to perceive other people through certain filters, could it be true that we don't even really see the person at all? We simply see what we think we're prepared to see. And we'll get into that a little bit more as well. Okay, so why is perception so important? The simple answer is our brain has to have an ability, moment to moment, to organize, interpret, and give meaning to all of the data that's flooding in through the senses. When you're awake, your brain every second is being flooded with information coming in from all of the senses. So right now, wherever you are when you're listening to this video, are you taking in a lot of visual data from what you're seeing on the screen? Are you taking in a lot of auditory data from what you're hearing? But even though you may not be paying attention to your other senses, let's do a reality check. Is there a taste in your mouth? You may notice that there's some sort of taste in your mouth, but you weren't noticing until what? I pointed it out to you. If you're sitting, can you feel your butt and the back of your legs on your seat? Again, you probably weren't noticing that because that's not relevant data at this moment. It's more important to stay tuned to the visual image and the auditory, what you're hearing, coming in through your ears, right? Are there any smells in the environment around you? If you're watching this at home and in the kitchen, somebody's cooking flan, somebody is making flan. I like flan. Right? Might you be smelling the food that's cooking, even though you might not have been paying attention to it? Now, let's take that one step further. Let's say that somebody's cooking in the room next to you, and your belly at this moment is full of food. You might not even pay much attention to the smell of the food that's cooking, but what if you haven't eaten for 10 hours? If your body is physically hungry, if your biological hunger drive is in maximum mode, are you more likely to perceive and pay attention to anything that reminds you of food than if your belly is full of food? And isn't that true for a lot of things? When you're thirsty, do you pay more attention automatically to anything in the world around you that has to do with getting a drink in your mouth? It's also true with sex, and it's also true with aggression. The 4 biological drives that you and I are born with: hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. They're always there. They're there to keep us alive and to keep our species alive. But we may not always be perceiving those drives unless we're in a need-deprived state. So with anger, for example, if you're not angry at all right now, if you're not feeling angry, there might be things out there in the world that are minor annoyances to you, but that's it. But if you got angry an hour ago about something else, unrelated to this lecture, and I hope this lecture doesn't piss you off too much. If it does, I apologize. Right? If you were angry when you turned this lecture on, could the internal drive state of being angry, cause you to perceive the world differently until that anger level begins to subside to some extent? The answer is yes. Right? So as we change internally, as drives come and go, as needs appear and then vanish, we're going to perceive the world differently. So here's one really important point to take away. There is no one reality. Even for one human being, what they pay attention to, what they perceive moment to moment, varies depending on their psychological framework, the emotions they're feeling, and where their biological drives are at. If that's true for one human being, it's even way more true across people. So you see, you and I sometimes live in a world of illusion. We automatically tend to assume that I'm perceiving things, and if you're next to me at the same moment, you're sharing my perceptions. That is not necessarily true. Right? Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you're taking a class on campus and the class ends at 10 o'clock at night, and you have to walk all by yourself across a dark campus to get to the parking lot where your car is. In general, will the men in the classroom take that walk in somewhat of a different way psychologically than the women in the same classroom? You're walking alone. I'm creating that scenario for you. Will many women, because of the world in which we live, take that walk across a dark campus with their eyes wide open looking and ears wide open looking for potential threats? And will a lot of men not have that experience? Will a lot of men on campus walk through campus in the dark, pretty much oblivious to personal danger, right? Now, that doesn't mean that one gender is underreacting to threat and that the other gender is overreacting to threat. What it means is that there are moments when women and men live in two different worlds and will perceive reality in different ways. And is not the same thing true when it comes to differences in lived experience around issues of race or class or sexual orientation, right? Who we are and the experiences that are real for us will always shape somebody's perception. The next time you think somebody's overreacting in a given situation, you might want to do a reality check and just ask yourself the question, how might they be perceiving the situation differently than I am? And based on their perception, might their reaction actually for them make complete sense in a given situation? Again, notice that sensation is physical. We all do it the same. Perception is much more about the individual. Okay. So there's a lot of different things that come into play when we study perception. And I'd like to divide perception into two parts, inborn and learned. Inborn perception. To some extent, all human babies at the moment of birth have a brain and a nervous system that is structured, hardwired, to use certain rules to interpret what's coming in through vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell. So one part of perception is universal, it's physical, and we all do it the same way. But over here on the other side, there's a whole other type of perception, which is not inborn, it is learned. Now, I think some of you are probably saying, is this an example of nature versus nurture? And it is. Some of the way you and I perceive the world is genetic, and if you're a human being, you follow the same script. But there's other parts of the way you and I interpret reality that are unique to the individual. No matter how similarly you were raised to a brother or sister, there were differences in your lived experiences growing up and your siblings' lived experiences growing up. They might be similar, but they're not identical. Example, do parents treat sons and daughters differently in the same family? Absolutely. Do firstborn children often get treated differently than the youngest child in a family or a middle child in a family? Yes. If you're an only child, did you have a different set of experiences growing up in your family than if you're one of 3 kids or one of 10 kids, right? So it's an illusion when parents say, I treat all my children exactly the same. Even if you wanted to do that, you couldn't do that. It's not possible. So we're going to look at 2 different sides of the equation of perception. We're going to first look at what's called the innate or inborn side of perception, what we're wired with as humans. And then later on, we're going to take a look at the flip side, which is how our interpretation of reality, perception, has been shaped by our unique set of life experiences. So let's start with the inborn side. Excuse me for just a moment. I have a cold. This is the first cold I've had in about 5 years, but I have one. Okay, all right. So, yeah, we're going to do the inborn part first, and then we'll eventually get to the learned part. So I'm about to introduce a term that's an important term for you to recognize, and I'm going to just write it here on a piece of paper so you see the word. All of this is talked about in your textbook. So the term I want to introduce is called, it's the word Gestalt. 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 Gestalt is a German word. And in German, the word Gestalt means shape. So a circle is a particular Gestalt. A square is a particular Gestalt, and so on. So why am I introducing this strange sounding German word? The reason is, back in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago, a group of early psychologists in Germany were doing research on the way in which the human brain interprets, deals with different shaped objects. And the Gestalt psychologists basically designed many experiments over a period of years that demonstrated that the human brain has a certain set of built-in rules, hardwired, that partly determine how we will perceive or interpret a straight line versus a triangle versus a square versus a circle. Now, this research, as I said a moment ago, it's almost a century old. Many, many other psychologists came along after these Gestalt psychologists. They took the word Gestalt, meaning shape, and kind of owned it, who have continued this research. So we know a lot about how the human brain is genetically wired to use certain rules to organize what's coming in through the senses. Now, a lot of the examples I'm going to use in a few minutes are vision, but these are also true for all of the other senses of the body, not just what you're seeing with your eyes. So why do I emphasize vision? The number one sense that humans rely on to know about the world is the sense of vision. And that's not just true for humans, that's true for primates in general. Humans, monkeys, apes, chimps, gorillas are highly visual creatures. Are there other animals that don't rely as much on vision? Are there animals that don't even have eyes? Well, the mole, right? That kind of, if you've ever had a garden and the garden is infested with moles, you'll know it because they leave these little tunnels underground that you can easily see, right? Moles don't have eyes, but why would they? They spend their entire lives underground where it's completely dark. They don't need eyes. Moles rely profoundly on the sense of smell to know where they are in the world. You and I are different. Primates rely very much on vision. So a lot of my examples are going to be visually based, just because that's the sense that we use. Now, remember individual differences. Here's a question I'll often ask students to think about. We'll do it, it's like a thought experiment. Imagine that starting tomorrow, you were going to have to spend the rest of your life either completely blind or completely deaf. You get to choose which sense, hearing or vision, goes away tomorrow for the rest of your life. And then I'll say to students, which one would you pick? Now, I've been asking this question for 20 years in IntroPsych courses. The majority of students will reluctantly say, they'll say, this sucks, I wish that, and I'll say, yeah, I know it does, but play along with it. And the majority of students will say, I would let go my hearing and keep my sight. And when I ask students why, one of the most common reasons is I could still do a lot of things if I'm deaf as long as I have my eyes. I could still drive a car. I could still play a sport. But there's always a significant minority of students who say exactly the opposite. And what they say is pretty much, I could not live if I couldn't hear. And here are the two most common responses. If I couldn't hear either the voices of people I love, or if I couldn't hear music. When you ask real musicians this sort of dilemma and they have to choose, not surprisingly, musicians are more likely as a group to let go their vision but keep their hearing, because the thought of not being able to listen to music and therefore in some ways to play music is a terrible loss for them. And you've probably heard that story about the classical composer Beethoven, who lost his hearing, but he was able to, he trained other senses in his body that by putting his hands on a piano, he could interpret the vibrations coming off the piano itself, off the musical instrument, and kind of convert that to the equivalent in his brain of hearing. Okay, so I'm going to take you through several Gestalt laws. There are many. They're talked about in your textbook. We're going to cover 4 of them, just 4 of the many. And I want to start with the Gestalt law that is by far the most basic of all. In fact, what we're about to talk about, you've probably all heard of it, and if you're an artist, a visual artist, you probably know a lot about it. It's called figure ground perception. Figure ground perception. This is so basic that a lot of times we don't even mention it as important because we don't even realize how important it is. Figure ground perception basically means the human brain is genetically wired to notice certain objects in the world around us as figures that are standing out against other objects behind them called backgrounds. Now, we don't call it figure background, we just call it figure dash ground perception. So if you look at me on the screen right now, my head and my flannel are figures standing out against the background of the gaming chair behind me, and is the gaming chair standing out against the background of the kitchen cabinets that are behind it. Nobody had to teach your brain how to do that. Your brain does that automatically. That's an example of figure ground perception. Now, can you all think about why this is so incredibly important? Could an animal survive if it didn't have figure ground perception? And the answer is a big no. For an animal to hunt food, does it have to be able to see the potential prey as a figure and pay attention to the way the figure is moving against the background? Right? For you to drive a car, does your brain automatically have to be able to do figure ground perception? Right? If you couldn't do figure ground perception, you couldn't see the other cars around you standing out against the trees moving in the background or the road in the background. So figure ground perception is found in all animals, and it is absolutely mandatory for survival. It is so hardwired into the brain, so deeply wired, that even when somebody has end-stage Alzheimer's disease and their brain has fallen off the cliff, they will still be able to do figure ground perception. It's that deeply programmed into the human nervous system. Now, there are times, so let me give you another example. Let's do one from hearing, not just vision. You get in your car, you start driving, you turn on the radio, you're listening to music. At that moment, the music coming into your ears is the figure. And all of the other sounds, the wind rushing past the windows, the sound of the engine, the sound of the tires on the road, those other sounds are in the background. But let's say all of a sudden something goes wrong with the engine, and the engine, the motor, begins to make very strange sounds. will you do what's called a figure ground reversal. Instantly, as you grow aware of and concerned about the sound coming from the motor, that sound, that weird sound coming from the engine, will become the figure, and the music will fade into the background. You just did a 180. You flipped it around automatically. Do you need to be able to do that for survival? Are there times that something you're not paying attention to becomes damned important, and all of a sudden you have to pay attention to it and ignore all of the other data? Now, let's say you decide that that sound doesn't mean anything worrisome or important. Once you calm back down, are you likely to default back to your original figure ground perception? You start to listen to the music again, and the sound of the engine fades to the background. So that's the same thing, but it's done with hearing. I just mentioned the term a figure ground reversal. There are times for all animals when we swap the background and the figure, and the background or part of the background becomes the figure. Now, these are examples of what is called in psychology ambiguous stimuli. Ambiguous stimuli. When something is ambiguous, it's open to more than just one interpretation. You can see it, you can perceive it in different ways. A stimuli, the singular is stimulus, L-U-S, is simply something in your environment that you're paying attention to. A long time ago, an illusionist, an artist named Necker, N-E-C-K-E-R, drew a picture of what today is called the Necker cube. And I'm going to put it up on the screen in just a minute, and I'm pretty sure you've all seen it. It looks like this. Hang on just a moment. This is a Necker cube. It's not a good one. I drew it freehand, so it's got some problems with it. But let me ask you to just stare at this for a while. When you look at a Necker cube, here's what happens to most people. Some people see it instantly. Other people can take minutes before they see it. But as you stare at this, how many of you notice that it seems to be able to be perceived in more than one way? The box, the three-dimensional, it's actually two-dimensional, but the three-dimensional illusion of this box can sometimes begin to pop in two different directions. So at a certain moment, you might see it from one angle, and then if you blink your eyes fast a few times, it may pop to a different angle, right? This is an ambiguous stimulus. It is hard for your brain to lock in to only one way to decide what is the figure and what is in the background. So most of us start to see this moving back and forth in a way that's a complete illusion. Now, the magic is not in the figure. The magic is in the fact that your brain does not quite know how to handle this. So it's ambiguous. This Necker cube, I'd like to suggest, is an example of life itself. Life is an ambiguous stimulus. All of those things that happen to us 24/7 when we're out interacting with the world are open to more than one interpretation. Now, that's a hard sell because most of us believe that our interpretation must be the only correct one, and all of the other interpretations that other people perceive must therefore be incorrect. That is a limited and naive way to view the world, right? One person's perceived truth can be another person's perceived falsehood, and vice versa. You and I could meet the same person, and I could walk away with a certain perception of them, and you might share some of it with me, but you also might share none of it with me, right? Think about what you find most easy to criticize in another person. Think about in your honest self where you are most critical of other people. There's a wonderful quote by Oscar Wilde. Here's the quote. "All criticism is a form of autobiography." The things that I think I see in you that I don't like may actually be saying something more about who I am than who you are. That's not a very comfortable thought if you really ponder it. It may mean that we think we're seeing other people objectively, but we're really seeing them through the filter of who we are or the mood we're in at a given moment. Okay, so I'd like to suggest that in a funny sort of way, life is a Necker cube. Life itself is kind of a Necker cube. All right, that's Gestalt law number one. Here comes Gestalt law number two. It is called the Gestalt law of similarity. Similarity. And what this basically means is the human brain is genetically wired to group objects in the same category when they appear to be similar to each other. Now, we didn't learn to do this as little boys or little girls. We were born with a brain that likes to simplify and dumb down the world by categorizing things based upon similar characteristics. Now, here's the trade-off. If our brains are wired to do that, we must be doing that for a damn important reason. And we are. The world outside of our skin is extremely complicated. It's sometimes just too much, too complicated, too rich with data for us to handle all at once. So the Gestalt law of similarity is a strategy, a biological strategy in the brain to take a complicated world and to simplify it. One of the ways of simplifying the world is by forming categorization, by forming groups based on similar characteristics. If 5 objects look similar, let's put them in the same group. If those 3 objects over there on the other side of the room look similar, let's put them in a separate group. So we do it for a reason. But I would like to suggest that when we use the Gestalt law of similarity too naively, and we don't think about what we're doing, we can kind of walk into some dark spaces. Is the overuse of the Gestalt law of similarity part of where racism comes from, where sexism comes from? Let me give you the verbal. All blacks, all Jews, all Irish, all women, all men, all rich people, all poor people. When we think like that, we are overusing the Gestalt law of similarity. We're taking everybody that shares a superficial characteristic like skin color or religious belief and dumping them all into the same category. Every one of us has done this. And every one of us, unless we think about what we're doing, can continue to do it. Would you agree with me that can lead to some pretty grim places? When we dump people mindlessly, thoughtlessly, into categories based on the Gestalt law of similarity, can a lot of people get hurt in that? We know the answer is yes. My better self knows that that's a destructive thing for me to do to other people. Your better self probably knows it too. So why do we do it? Well, we do it in part because, let me put it this way, the human brain is fundamentally lazy. The human brain likes to use the least amount of mental energy required to get an answer to a problem. It's harder for me to get to know you as individuals than it is for me to group you in the category of all college students. Now, if I do that, am I doing you a disservice? Absolutely. But if you mindlessly group me in the category of all college professors, and that's it, you're doing me a disservice too, right? And so it takes less energy to overly group people based on similar characteristics. Now, I'd like to suggest it's worth taking the energy to try not to do that. The Gestalt law of similarity is not by itself what leads to prejudice and discrimination. It takes more than that, but it's the first step in that direction. So the next time you hear somebody saying all Jews, all blacks, all Irish, it doesn't matter, it's all the same crap. Or the next time you notice that you're putting people in groups based on superficial characteristics, if you can push back on that and just be aware of it, then it gets harder to do that. And you're using energy to begin to see people as real people, right? I was at a faculty meeting a number of years ago, and the meeting had not yet started. So, people around me are talking and kind of have my eyes closed because going to a faculty meeting is like a gun to the head to begin with. But separate from that, so I'm lurking and I'm listening to the conversations. And I hear a colleague say this to another colleague. These effing 18-year-old students, blah, 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 blah. Was that colleague stupidly using the Gestalt law of similarity to take every 18-year-old student at SCCC and dump you all into the same group? Yes. Do you deserve better than that? You sure do. See where I'm going with this? We're built to do this because it makes it easier sometimes to just function in the world. But there is a downside with all of these Gestalt laws. They're necessary, they serve a purpose, but when done blindly, mindlessly, stupidly, they can lead to bad places. Okay, 2 more we're going to cover. The next Gestalt law is called the Gestalt law. Oh, guess what I didn't show you? I'm sorry. Let me stay with the similarity one more time. Let me just give you the visual handout on this. Here's the Gestalt law of similarity. What we have here are 16 circles. 4 of them are filled in. Your brain, when looking at this for the first time, will automatically create a diagonal perception from the top left to the bottom right. You'll take those 4 filled in circles, and because they are similar to each other, you will turn them into a group. You will not see 16 disconnected circles. You'll turn those 4 darkened circles into one mental grouping because it's easier and because your brain is hardwired to do it that way. So that's the Gestalt law of similarity. 2 more. The next one I want to talk a little bit about is called the Gestalt law of proximity, Proximity. When 2 or more objects are proximate to each other, what that means in ordinary English is those 2 objects are near each other. They're physically close together in space. The Gestalt law of proximity is another hardwired, built into the brain deal. And it basically means that we are genetically programmed that when we see objects that are proximate or near each other, we will put them in the same group. Objects near each other are perceived as belonging to the same group. Now, here's the visual of the Gestalt law of proximity. Here's the visual, right? So when I ask you to look at this, you don't see 18 circles. You see 3 groups, 3 vertical groups of 6 circles each. You turn these 3 columns or rows into groups 1, 2, and 3. Why? Because the distance from here to here is more proximate than the distance from here to here, right? If I turn it like this, right, then you do the same thing. It's now just that the groups are horizontal instead of vertical. So it's the same deal. Nobody had to teach you to do this. When a baby looks at this picture, they'll move their eyes in a certain pattern that lets scientists know that they see not 18 separate circles, but 3 groups of 6 circles each. That's the Gestalt law of proximity. When objects are near each other, proximate to each other, your brain will turn them into groupings. If you just heard that sound, it's the electric cat food bowl off of my shoulder over here. and probably within minutes you will see a large 21, almost 22 pound, there he is, tabby. His name is Summit. He's almost 22 pounds. He is a very large cat, and you will notice that he will quickly eat all of the food in there. Okay. Let me give you a real life example. Imagine you walk into a party in a large room, and the party started half an hour ago. When you walk in, if you walk into the room and there are 7 people at one end of the room standing near each other talking, and in the middle there's 5 people standing near each other talking, and at the far end of the room are 6 people standing near each other talking, you won't see 7 plus 5 plus 6. You'll see group 1, group 2, group 3 automatically. When people are physically near each other, we see them as forming a group. Now, could it be that they don't even know each other, right? Might they just have met 5 minutes earlier? Sure. But our brains are programmed when people are proximate to each other to turn them into a group. Now, there's nothing bizarre about this. If I'm walking down the hall in a building and you're walking toward me, and you're with 2 friends of yours, as the 3 of you walk toward me, if the 3 of you are proximate to each other, well, I tend to assume you have some sort of relationship with each other. And the answer, it could be no. I mean, it could just be your particular weirdness that you like to walk really close to strangers and freak them out. But it is more likely that the 3 of you have some sort of a connection to each other, right? So we make these implicit assumptions about people based on proximity, just like we did with similarity. Most of the time, some of the time, those perceptions may be accurate, but at other times they might not be accurate. They could be actually quite wrong. Okay. Last one is called the Gestalt law of closure. 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 Let me define closure first, and then I'll give you the visual, and then we'll talk about it in terms of what it means in relationships between people. The Gestalt law of closure is an automatic tendency to fill in missing details. An automatic tendency to fill in missing details. Or, to say it in a slightly different way, closure is the automatic genetic program in our brains to complete the incomplete. To complete the incomplete. Here's the visual. So I'm going to just hold this up really quickly. Get ready to look at it. And I'm not going to hold it up there like with the others. I'm just going to give you a quick look at it. Here we go. Okay. Many of you saw in your perception a shape that you would call a triangle. But now let's go back and look at it slower. It's not a triangle, is it? It's 3 separate lines in some sort of relationship to each other, but because it's missing the connecting pieces, it is not a triangle. But remember why we do these Gestalt laws. They make the world simpler. It's easier for your brain to misperceive this as a triangle than to struggle with 3 disconnected lines that have some sort of weird angular relationship to each other. Filling in the missing pieces. Your brain fills in the little missing parts, and it turns it into something that looks a little bit more like this. Right? Now it's a triangle. Right? We'll do the same thing with a circle that's almost closed but has a tiny little gap somewhere in the circle. Your brain will simplify it by seeing it as a circle, even though technically you know that it's not. So why do we care about this? Well, one of the reasons I care about this is we do this with each other all the time, often without even knowing we're doing it. And this can also lead to stereotyping when it comes to the way we treat people. Right? If I know A, B, C, D, and E about you, is it easy for me to guess that I also know F, G, H, I, and J? I might be right, but could I also be wrong? Have you ever thought you really knew somebody, based on your observations of them over a period of time, only to discover down the road that they throw you a real surprise and a big curveball when you realize that they don't fit your assumptions about them. It used to be, a lot of people used to believe that guys who had really long hair always identified with being kind of the new generation of hippies. That is far from true. Are there guys with real long hair who are in no way neoliberals in their political thinking or in their lifestyle view and are highly conservative people? Absolutely. But they tend not to always fit the stereotype. And so if we see their long hair and they dress a certain way and they drive a green vehicle, like environmentally green vehicle, might we make the assumption, sometimes incorrect, that they probably code for highly liberal points of view across the board? That is far from true. And the reverse can also be far from true, right? When we know certain things about somebody, we tend to over-assume that we know things about them that they've never told us. We try to make educated guesses. Now, sometimes our educated guess is correct. You've had a number of weeks now to observe me as your college professor. And I dress a certain way, and I talk a certain way, and I joke a lot about weed, and da, 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 da. So if I asked you to kind of put me where you think I might be politically, on the spectrum from ultra-conservative right-wing to ultra-liberal left-wing, think about where you'd put me. Hello. Stop with the fingers. Don't give students the fingers. Rich, you've been at this 51 minutes. You've been doing pretty well. Just finish it. I'm back now. Okay. When I've asked this to students in the past few years, most students would put me more to the liberal left-leaning place politically. And if you did that, you're absolutely correct. Based upon certain data you already know about me, you made a correct inference about my political leanings. But every once in a while, somebody will look at my age and they'll not look at the rest of the data and say, he's an old guy. He's an old white guy. He's probably a right-winger, ultra-conservative, which I am not. So sometimes we get it right when we use the Gestalt law of closure, but sometimes we get it very, very wrong when we use the Gestalt law of closure. Nevertheless, why are we doing it? Because our brains are lazy. It's simpler to just make assumptions. Maybe the learning here for all of us is we shouldn't be so quick to make assumptions, and we should look for accurate information to see what assumptions we have about each other are true and which other assumptions are fallacies and just false. Okay, so we've done the Gestalt laws. We have focused on the inborn side of perception. What we're going to be doing this coming week in class, all of my 3 classes, I teach 3 sections this semester of intro, is we're going to be focusing one class on the flip side, which is how perception is tied to each of our backgrounds, our culture, what we learned from our families growing up, what we learned from where we went to school growing up, and so on, our neighborhoods. That's the flip side of perception. I'm not putting that on this video. We're getting close to an hour. That's enough, right? There's a lot of information here. So that's coming later next week in our classes. I want to remind all my 3 sections of this class that I will be handing out the first exam this coming week. We'll go over it in class. So we're going to finish perception. This coming week, we're going to talk about learned perception. And then we're off to trying to figure out what my cat is doing. And then you'll be off the following week for spring break. So I hope you found this interesting. Can you see why that you needed to take notes on this? All of this, what we're covering today, will be on exam 1 coming towards you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.